Welcome to Mending Monday, where we talk about healers' results in the Mythic Raid testing that happened this weekend. We went yesterday through the DPS results, so now it's time for the healers. I know I made a mistake. I should have went with the healers video first, as we all know healers are much more important and relevant than DPS players, but I decided to go with the masses and decided to go with the popular and low IQ role first. So now that we are on to the healers, this testing is quite relevant because it lasted a full weekend. This was more testing than the previous month of testing combined because of how much more time we had in this testing. So the TLDR of the healers up to this point, ever since the first round of testing with Igira, was that the overall start was that Mistweaver, Holy Paladin and Preservation Evoker were the overall better performers. Then you had Discipline to be somewhat in the middle, together with Restoration Druid, and then Resto Shaman and Holy Priest being by far the worst ones. However, we had a change. Ever since the 5th of October change, where Shaman was buffed, we saw Resto Shaman starting to creep up in good results more and more. Until we get to today. We get to today's testing with Igira first, where you still see the top 3 being the same, Preservation, Mistweaver and Holy Paladin, but now Restoration Shaman has now joined the gang. Discipline is still average and Holy Priest is still the weakest performer. Starting with the most changed spec by the tuning of the last couple of weeks, you have Resto Shaman, which received a buff, slight buff to their 4-piece, which is not very relevant because it's not very powerful to begin with. What was way more powerful was buffing Chain Heal by 20%. The reason why this is super relevant is because old Shaman, and by old I mean 2 to 3 weeks ago, was forced, so to speak, to play with Healing Wave. Chain Heal was so weak that to proc your tier set, the tier set of Resto Shaman, which was using a direct heal marks the target with Tidal Reservoir. And then Riptide healing a target with Tidal Reservoir has a chance to spread Riptide to another target. So the whole playstyle was a pairing game where Riptide is on a player, you cast Healing Wave so that they get the Tidal Reservoir buff, so they have a chance to spread Riptide. Riptide spreads, fine, cast Healing Wave on that target so they get the buff, with a chance to spread more Riptides. That was the whole playstyle. The problem was that this playstyle had a terrible option for AoE. You were just doing single target healing constantly, you had to rely on basically Cloudburst and Healing Rain to even do decent AoE, and you were, as expected, dodging all of the Chain Heal buffing talent. This one wasn't taken, Unleash Life wasn't taken, this one wasn't taken, a High Tide wasn't taken because you weren't playing with Chain Heal. This new buff has unlocked Chain Heal to be used by the Resto Shaman. As a result, obviously, the talents that buff Chain Heal are all being taken. You have Ancestral Reach, you have Unleash Life, you have Tidebringer, and you have High Tide. And the result is, of course, that now your Chain Heal is a nuke. Average heal of a single Chain Heal, 526,000. You can see by the red spikes here, those are the Chain Heals. You can zoom in on one of these big spikes and you can see that for 3 Chain Heals, the average was 836,000 healing per Chain Heal. This has massive synergy with your Ascendance. That is why, with this new build, you want to play with both Ascendance and deeply rooted elements to have as many Ascendance windows as possible. Why? Because Ascendance spreads 80% of the healing you do to any other player within 40 yards. So basically infinite range in a raid. This is of course super powerful when your healing is 800,000 per cast. The value of this Restorative Mist healing becomes massive, becomes huge, compared to the limp dick healing of a Healing Wave, which is healing for 143,000 per cast, which means Restorative Mist has a much lower value with this build. But if you're playing around Chain Heal instead, Restorative Mist now has a much increased power level. So this set of changes, Resto Shaman has made them, at the moment, one of the better overall HPS performers in the raid, together with the previously already known 3 specs. The previously already known 3 specs, starting with Holy Paladin, we see Holy Paladin in a peculiar situation split between 3 different builds, an extreme one here, an extreme one here, and the average in the middle. The extreme one on one side is the one that casts Holy Shock and Flash of Light and then ignores the spenders. Word of Glory, Light of Dawn, nowhere to be seen. The one extreme on the opposite is the one that spams Holy Shock with Light of Dawn and doesn't cast Flash of Light whatsoever. It only uses Holy Light to enable the Hand of Divinity talent, and that's it. And then you have the hybrid, the middle of the way. You have the one that casts Holy Shock, and then casts Flash of Light, and then casts Light of Dawn. All together. That's the current divide between the three different builds. The one for a more caster Paladin, range Paladin. This Paladin basically is not even gonna bother using Crusader Strike, just a couple of casts. It's also barely even going to bother to use Consecration because it's not in melee range that much. And then you have the ones that is more melee centric because you're not using Flash of Light, you're not gaining Holy Power with Flash of Light. Also, perhaps the only other change is that when you are playing around Flash of Light, you're also able to go for Beacon of Virtue, which is not something that used in the raid right now. That's because Flash of Light allows you for higher bursts of healing. You can see here the burst healing of a Holy Paladin barely manages to peak past 300,000. But if you go to the Flash of Light version, they do get past 300,000 many times, and that's thanks to Beacon of Virtue, of course, giving you more chances at burst healing compared to the passive, always active double beacon of the other two Paladin builds. That is basically the one decision Holy Paladins have to take in 10.2, whether or not to play with more Flash of Lights or with just the typical Holy Shock into Spender over and over. That's because their tier set is not actually changing very much of their build. They are still getting even more power to their Glimmer and Holy Shock, which they were using plenty of before, and the 4-piece just makes Daybreak line up with Divine Toe. So it's a quality of life change that doesn't really modify your playstyle. And in the end, as mentioned, they are still performing very well in terms of overall HPS. So very stable, safe pick as a healer for 10.2 in the raid. After that, you have the other good performer, which is Preservation Evoker. Preservation Evoker doesn't have nearly as much of a question of builds like Holy Paladin does because they are all going for Blossom. They are going for the Blossom build. The only time they won't be going for the Blossom build is if you are doing a fight like Volcaros. Why? Because Volcaros is going to split your raid into two as you loop around the room. An Evoker, though, spamming 5 different Emerald Blossoms in a row would have kind of wanted to be stacked in the entire raid, which is not possible for most of the fight of Volcaros. Outside of that type of fight, though, it's just a Blossom Fiesta. The main change between the different builds of Evoker right now is choosing whether or not you want to go down the middle of your talent tree or if you want to take the new pick for Temporal Anomaly. Since Temporal Anomaly has been nerfed and no longer applies 5 echoes, on top of that, you don't even play with Stasis, you don't even play with the extra duration of Echo, you don't play with anything that buffs Echoes anymore. It was going to be worthless anyways. Instead, you're taking Nosdormu's Teachings to further reduce the cooldown of your Empower spells, and of course you're still taking Spiritual Clarity to also reduce the cooldown of Spirit Bloom. That's because your tier set, Evoker is special. Evoker is the only spec with only a 2-piece set bonus for preservation. The 4-piece doesn't exist. The 2-piece set bonus has your Empower spells cast Living Flames at enemies or allies at 40% effectiveness, meaning the more Empower spells, the more you can benefit from this. What is even more powerful is your Talent Essence Burst. Living Flame has a 20% chance to make your next Essence ability free. So, if you're using Dream Breath, you are targeting 5 players, you are shooting 5 Living Flames, that's a 20% chance, which is almost, unless you're very unlucky, almost guaranteed for you to gain 1 free spender every time you use an Empower spell. That's why it makes Nosdormu's Teachings very, very good, why it makes possibly Flow State to give you 10% more CDR very good, etc, etc. That's the main divide between the two builds. The healing of Living Flame can be very good, upwards of 10% of your total healing, so it's still quite a powerful effect for overall healing. The only thing you have to be a little bit more careful with this build for Evoker is the very heavy mana you are going to be spending with this build. Luckily, you do have a large amount of free essence spenders that you gain from the tier set that you might be able to do still fine anyways, but it is definitely something more dangerous than your older version, your older build of preservation, which was way better at conserving mana. After Evoker and Holy Paladin and Restoration Shaman, we have the overall, at the moment, the overall winner of the PTR when it comes to healers, which is Mistweaver Monk. We have mentioned why it's a winner multiple times. Mistweaver Monk works in 1 minute windows. They take a Yulon and then they take the cooldown reduction of Yulon down to a 1 minute cooldown. This gives them cyclical 1 minute periods of very high HPS through a series of combos they do. For starters, using Yulon gives you a 50% discount to Enveloping Mist, so the result is that every time you activate Yulon, you're gonna be spamming 4 to 5 Enveloping Mists because their mana is discounted. The other combo you're going to be going for is that whenever you are using Soothing Mist, you're gonna be following up Soothing Mist by a reasonable spam of Vivifies. That is mostly because whenever you use Soothing Mist, Vivify is instant. Also, because you are playing around with Clouded Focus, even if it's been nerfed, Clouded Focus increases the healing of Vivify and reduces the mana cost. So it makes it even more valuable. It's now instant, it now costs less mana, and it now heals more. This has now further synergy with your tier set. Renewing Mist increases the healing the target takes from you by 50%. So a simple play would be to put Renewing Mist on the player and then Soothing Mist and then spam it with Vivify to massively increase the healing done to the target. Why do you care about that? Well, you don't care about that much because as you can see here, a lot of the Vivify healing will be overhealing. Here is Vivify. 70 casts to do 82% overhealing. The reason why the overhealing is still powerful, the reason why buffing the healing done is powerful is because number one, it still gets stored by the tier set, the mini Cloudburst totem of the Mistweaver Monk, and number two, spamming Vivify, instacast Vivify, it is still good because you're not trying to heal with Vivify. What you're trying to do is to cast Vivify to enable Invigorating Mist. That is the AoE healing you are going for when you're going for this combo. And this set of combo, Yulon into Enveloping Mists, into spreading Renewing Mists to as many targets as you can, to then use Soothing Mist into Vivify spam to spread Invigorating Mist healing in AoE, is a cyclical combo done roughly every minute. And at the moment it is yielding the highest amount of HPS on mostly basically every type of fight. If we have to find one weakness for Mistweaver Monk, besides number one being melee, so we can already assume one spot in melee has to be taken by Holy Paladin, so you would have to run double melee healer, which starts getting kind of sketchy. The other problem is that besides this 1 minute cycle of heals, Mistweaver Monk has nothing else, has no other major significant cooldowns. So when you are in a situation where Mistweaver Monk is, 6 to 8% healing ahead of Preservation Evoker, but Preservation Evoker has Emerald Communion, even though with the Blossom build is much weaker. It has Dream Breath, it has Rewind, possibly it has Rescue, maybe even Zephyr. Is it actually better to have 6 to 8% more straight healing if you are going to miss strong cooldowns in return? That is, at the moment, the main weakness of Mistweaver. They do have the strongest consistent HPS, but they remain one of the weakest, if not the weakest healer when it comes to big cooldown. That is the power they have to pay for having such consistent, as you can see here, consistent bumps of 1 minute bursts of healing. The fact that now they can't have one major big cooldown. They do have, of course, Revival or Restoral, but look at this. This is just a joke. It's not a relevant cooldown when you compare it with something like, for example, Rewind. That's a much bigger cooldown. So that is perhaps the main weakness of Mistweaver, on top of them being melee, that we will have in 10.2 when it comes to raiding. Now, we talked about the positive, the real positive ones. Let's talk about the middle of the pack, kind of, starting with Restoration Druid. So Restoration Druid, there isn't actually much to talk about because they haven't actually changed the many sets of tuning have not gone to touch much of what Druid does. They still continue to have the same, passive, somewhat boring tier set of having a lot of your healing done by your Grove Guardians. So some players might not like, for example, a fourth of their healing being completely AFK, passive, and done by someone else. The only flavor, the only extra the tier set or the balance tuning has brought to you is that now clear casting causes your regrowth to also cast Nourish onto a nearby ally. So it makes it worth to spend clear casting with regrowth. So the result is that now how many clear casting buffs do you receive in a fight? You got 39. So how many casts of regrowth did you have? 39. That's basically it. You spend clear casting with regrowth, you spam Reju, and then before using Wild Growth, you use Swiftmend. That's it. That's all you do as a Resto Druid. Remember to keep up your efflorescence, your life blooms. That's it. Nothing major besides this is changing in the build of Resto Druid. We might actually say it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse because, of course, your Flourish has been terribly butchered in this patch and it is now much, much weaker. It's no longer lasting for 8 seconds, but for 6, and it's not increasing the tick rate of your HOTS by 100%, but by 25. So you do gain slightly even more consistent healing, but you lose even more of what was already your weakness, which was cooldowns, much like Mistweaver Monk. What is left after Druid are the 2 priest specs. To be fair, Holy Priest is the one that has confused me the most on the PTR, looking at what has changed for them, which is in particular the major change of their tier set. Now, they are no longer playing nearly as much around Prayer of Mending, about casting as many as you can, spreading as many as you can. Now it's all Renew gaming. Your Holy Words now apply Renew to the targets they heal, and now the ticking of Renew has a chance to make your next Holy Word do not consume a charge, cost 50% less mana, and stack up 2 times. This means that now you play like an Evoker, With the Evoker, before a big burst of damage, wants to get 2 free spenders, wants to get 2 free Essence Burst charges to cast 2 free Emerald Blossoms. So you can do 2 Emerald Blossoms for free and 2 Emerald Blossoms with your combo points, basically, to cast 4 of them. Holy Priest now can do the same. They can get this one to stack up 2 times, and when the AoE comes, they can do 2 free Sanctifies and then 2 Sanctifies with their charges. It basically works in a very similar way. This has even more synergy with their Divine Image, because of course Divine Image stacks up its power based on how many Holy Words you are casting, and of course with a tier set like this, you're going to be casting roughly 50 to 70% more Holy Words that you're currently casting on live, making Divine Image have an even stronger effect. You might even be thinking about playing with Rapid Recovery, increasing the healing done of Renew by 35%, but decreasing the base duration by 3 seconds. The base duration by 3 seconds does not affect the duration of this Renew being applied. It does not affect the duration of the Renew applied by Benediction. It does not affect the Renew applied by Revitalizing Prayers. The only Renew that gets actually shortened by this is the one casted by you directly or by Salvation, which still makes this talent very, very valuable. The only mistake this healer did was to take away 1 talent from Epiphany. You don't play around Prayer of Mending anymore. You're going to be putting 2 talent points into Light of the Naru, 0 into Epiphany, and only 1 into Harmonious Apparatus to make space for Rapid Recovery. However, after talking about all of this for Holy Priest, their results right now are more lacking than the rest. That's why I said I am confused, because after looking and testing the Holy Priest on the PTR, they do look good. They play good. They flow good with a much faster, much heavier usage of your Holy Words and not nearly as many Prayers of Mending. It does feel still like a good playstyle. However, at the moment, it's just that the performance, the actual numbers are not nearly as positive as the rest of the healing gang. They might just be needing something as little of a change as Resto Shaman got. That's just a 20% more healing, on one of these things on Renew, maybe on Sanctify. After all, Priest received a 15% nerf to their Mastery, which was quite heavy, and a 5% nerf to Prayer of Mending, which was also hurtful. So maybe revert those, maybe partially revert those to try to up the numbers a little bit more, and then I think it's in a pretty good state in terms of playstyle. The one we have left for last is not because there is something special, but perhaps the opposite, mostly because there is not too much talk about when it comes to discipline. First of all, they received many talent changes in the PTR. They play in a much different way. You don't click Schism anymore, it's into your talents. You don't click Shadow Covenant anymore, it's into your talents. You don't have 2 charges of Mind Blast anymore, you have 1 on a much longer cooldown. So everything has been sped up. For Discipline Priest, it's much faster to do your ramp. Your previously 20 seconds long ramp now can be done much more quickly. If you play with Ultimate Penitence, you literally have no ramp. You can literally tag 20 players with Atonement in something like 3 seconds. You cast double Radiance and 1 Ultimate Penitence, and 20 players got their Atonement. So it has gotten much faster, it's much better in terms of the way they can flow as a spec. They still have their usual Giga Burst of healing. The only main problem is going to be whether or not the boss fights will actually require this Giga Burst of healing, or they will be more towards consistent HPS. Since this is something Blizzard pointed out, they have been nerfing many of the raid cooldowns, many of the damage reduction cooldowns all over the place, so maybe they're also planning for bosses themselves to not require nearly as many big ramps of a healer anymore. That's the only main thing for Discipline. If we have some dangerous levels of burst healings for bosses, then Discipline Priest will go back to being a very valuable spec for progression. Remember, on progression, we are undergeared, we are squishier, we have less HP, the bosses have been unnerfed, meaning that the burst style of healing of a Discipline Priest, the barrier damage reduction given by a Discipline Priest, all have way more value than the value you can see a Discipline Priest have during farm, where it becomes much lower. This is, at the moment, the state of healers after looking through all the 3 bosses of this testing. Most of them were the first 2, Volcaros and Igira, because they were 4 to 7 minutes long. The last boss, being Tindral, was basically just 70 seconds, which is just mostly irrelevant when you're looking at the healers' results. Right now, the TLDR would be Mistweaver very well in terms of pure HPS, Holy Paladin very well overall, Preservation Evoker very well overall, Restoration Druid, it's good, but it has the problem of doing the same things a Mistweaver Monk does, but worse. Discipline Priest, still fine, provided the boss damage profiles are fitting for their healing profile. Restoration Shaman, now also very good after being buffed. And lastly, you have Holy Priest, which could be very good in terms of playstyle and what they want to do with their spells, but they do need somewhat of a 10 to 15% healing buff here or there to some of their abilities. So this is the current situation when it comes to the results of the last round of Mythic Raid testing in the PTR when it comes to healers. With this out of the way, I am now going to leave you to your own conclusions and your own speculations on what and which healers are going to be the powerful ones in the 10.2 patch coming now in about 3 weeks. So with this out of the way, it's time to leave each other, as I have to go and work out, take a shower before we actually go and do our farm, our weekly farm run for today. So thanks of course as usual to all of the dear Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which can still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these useless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys soon, and in the meantime, I said we can make this in 15 minutes. I have to talk about 7 specs, only 7. This ought to be a short one.